The desert wind, a tireless sculptor of regret, swept dust through the skeletal remains of Whispering Rock, New Mexico. It was 1985, and for Thomas Red Elk, the wind was a constant companion, whispering names he hadn't dared speak aloud in years. He sat beside his rusted 1971 camper, a tin can mausoleum for a life spent searching, its faded paint peeling like sunburnt skin. At 58, he was a map of hard miles and broken promises, clinging to a single yellowed photograph. He spread the newspaper clipping across his lap, with the reverence of a man handling a sacred relic. 40 years old this paper was, but its creases were as familiar as the lines on his own hands. Indian boarding schools. Forging America's bright future. Below the optimistic headline was the photograph that had colonized his dreams. 3 young girls sat on the wooden porch steps of a small chapel, their dark hair braided so tightly it pulled at their scalps, their white cotton dresses pressed and bleached for the cameras. Behind them, slightly out of focus, but unmistakably present, stood a priest in black robes, a Bible clutched in his hand, like a weapon. Thomas knew every shadow in that photograph, the precise way Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, a study in forced stillness, the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of Naomi's left shoulder from an old injury, the solemn, unchildlike gravity on little Eva's face that made her look older than her 8 years. Those weren't their real names, of course. The boarding school had stripped those away, along with their language, their beliefs, their very identity. Sarah had been born Nijoni. She flows around, their grandmother's choice because the child had arrived during the spring floods. Naomi was Elise. She is precious. And Eva, little Eva, was Ayana, joy. They had been his baby sisters, torn from their family in Cottonwood Bluffs when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came with their official papers, their hollow promises, and their devastating lies. He'd been 14 when they came for the 4 of them, using their father's arrest as justification. His father had resisted when government agents tried to seize their ancestral lands, a final feudal act of defiance. Their mother had died giving birth to Ayana, leaving the children vulnerable to the federal assimilation policy that swept through Indian country like a plague. Wards of the state, they'd called them, as if being made orphans by the very system that claimed to protect them was some kind of gift. St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school had been their prison. The boys and girls were kept strictly separated, a cruel architecture of control. He rarely saw his sisters, except during the mandatory morning mass and evening devotions, 2 brief windows across a crowded chapel. Even then, speaking to them in Dini was a cardinal sin, punishable by days locked in the damp, lightless basement. Or worse, the beatings with a leather strap that left marks hidden beneath their drab uniforms. But the worst day, the day that still woke him in the dead of night with a gasp and a cold sweat, had been in 1945. World War II was ending, a global conflagration subsiding, but the quiet war against his people remained as sharp and relentless as ever. The school had been preparing for weeks for what they called a press visit. Thomas remembered the frantic energy, the forced smiles, the way they had lined up the children like products in a store window. The youngest ones were placed prominently, their wide, frightened eyes photographing well, easily misinterpreted by a white audience as reverence or awe. His sisters had been chosen specifically for the photo session because of what the priest called their innocent beauty. The reporters had come with their bulky cameras and notepads, lobbing scripted questions about gratitude and salvation, while the priests nodded approvingly. They had taken dozens of photographs, including the one now spread across Thomas's lap. The next day, His sisters were gone. The realization had dawned slowly, a creeping dread during morning mass, when their usual spots in the girls' section remained empty. By evening devotions, when they still hadn't appeared, a raw, primal panic had set in. He had approached the guardians, the stern-faced nuns and priests, asking desperately about his sisters. Their answer was silence, then violence. They had beaten him for his insolence, locked him in the basement for 3 days, and told him to forget he'd ever had sisters at all. But Thomas couldn't forget. When the beatings intensified and still no information came, he had made his escape. At 18, he was technically an adult, and the school's half-hearted search efforts lasted only a few days. There had been no missing child flyers, no real police investigation, just the quiet, implicit understanding that one more Indian boy had disappeared into the vast American landscape, and no one in authority particularly cared. For 40 years, he had wandered the Southwest in his camper, a ghost chasing ghosts. He followed whispers and rumors, showing that newspaper photograph to anyone who would look. He had survived on odd jobs, construction work when his back could handle it, small engine repairs for cash, occasional handouts from veteran shelters, though he'd never served in a recognized war. Whispering Rock had been his home for the last decade, not because he'd found any trace of his sisters, but because he'd finally run out of road. The town was dying, just like he was, and it seemed an appropriate place to wait for the end. The beer bottle made a hollow sound as he drained the last of its contents. He cursed under his breath, folding the newspaper with meticulous care and placing it back on the passenger seat where it lived. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, listening to the engine cough to life like an old man clearing his throat. The only liquor store in this tired little town was 10 minutes away, and Marta would be there. The bell above the door chimed as Thomas entered, and Marta Dane looked up from behind the counter, a smile crinkling the corners of her kind eyes. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a face that had seen enough of life to understand suffering without judgment. "Tommy," she said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "Let me guess." The beer ran out again. He managed a weak smile. Marta was one of the few people in Whispering Rock who treated him like a human being, rather than a cautionary tale. "You know me too well, Marta." He retrieved 6 bottles of the cheapest beer from the cooler and carried them to the counter. As he reached for his wallet, his heart sank. The crumpled bills in his pocket amounted to less than half of what he needed. He'd forgotten about the money he'd spent on gas, and his next disability check wasn't due for days. Marta watched him count and recount the bills, her expression softening with concern. "Tommy, you look tired. When was the last time you had a real meal?" She leaned forward. "I know this isn't easy for you, what you carry. I've seen the newspaper. Maybe you could come to church with me this Sunday. You look like you could use it." His first instinct was to refuse. Church wasn't a place for someone like him. The Catholicism of his youth was a language of punishment, a tool of erasure. "I'm not religious, Marta," he said quietly. "I don't think your God would want me there." Marta's eyes sparkled with determination. "Tell you what, if you come to church with me and stay for the entire service, I'll buy you these 6 bottles of beer. And if you're still not convinced it helped, I'll throw in 2 extra." He stared at her. "You're trying to bribe me with alcohol to go to church? Isn't that against the rules?" Marta laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Maybe. But sometimes God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes people need practical incentives." The offer was too good to refuse. 8 bottles of beer for sitting through 1 church service. "Okay," he said finally. "But I'm doing this for the beer, not for salvation. That's honest, at least, she smiled. The service starts in 30 minutes at Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. Just follow the main road toward the mountains. Inside Holy Martyrs, the afternoon light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the pews. Thomas followed Marta to a seat near the back, feeling out of place in his worn t-shirt. He slumped into the hard wooden seat, arms crossed, waiting for the ordeal to end. Then something caught his attention. To the side of the altar stood a group of 5 nuns, their black robes stark against the whitewashed adobe. They were different from the local sisters, and most of them, he realized with a jolt, appeared to be indigenous women. An uncomfortable feeling, a phantom echo of St. Gertrude's, tightened his chest. When the service was nearly over, the priest, Father Murphy, made an announcement. The sisters from the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna are visiting us today. They are here to offer healing prayers for our congregation. As people began to move toward the exit, Father Murphy approached them, his gaze falling on Thomas. They spoke for a few minutes, Thomas vaguely admitting his struggles, though carefully avoiding the mention of his sisters. That wound was too deep, too private. The Handmaid Sisters live very solemn lives, Father Murphy explained. Vows of silence, complete seclusion. This annual tour is their only contact with the outside world. You can write a prayer request, and they will pray over it at their monastery. In a few weeks, they write replies, delivering God's message. Marta nudged him. Spurred by a flicker of desperate curiosity, Thomas walked to the front. His handwriting was shaky as he wrote his name and his request, the words torn from a place of hopelessness he rarely acknowledged. Please, God, tell me where my 3 sisters are. He lit a candle, the flame a tiny dancing prayer in the still air. As he approached the box where the 5 nuns stood guard, he looked up at the one standing closest. He felt an inexplicable urge to speak. If you're right about this, he said quietly, if your God is stronger than our spirits, then he should be able to tell me where they are. If he does, I'll be a Catholic for life. The nun didn't smile, but he saw something shift in her eyes, a flicker of what looked like empathy. As he turned away, he glanced back one last time. He watched as that same nun lifted the heavy prayer box. She limped noticeably as she walked, favoring her right leg, and nearly stumbled. As she reached a side door, a gust of wind caught her habit, pulling it away from her face. For one heart-stopping moment, Thomas saw her left temple clearly, and there, partially hidden, was a thick, raised scar. The world went silent. The air left his lungs. Naomi. Elise. She had gotten that scar defending little Eva from a nun's wooden ruler. He remembered her whispering the story to him after Mass, her voice shaking, the new scar still tender. He opened his mouth to call her name, but the door clicked shut. He was frozen, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Hope, an emotion so foreign it felt like pain, surged through him. Thomas's mind was reeling as he stumbled back to Marta and Father Murphy. I saw one of the nuns limping, he stammered. It reminded me of something. The dam of his 40-year silence broke. Father, I need to tell you. I had 3 sisters. They've been missing for 40 years. They were taken from St. Gertrude's Indian boarding school. He told the priest everything. The press visit, the disappearance, the beatings. Father Murphy's expression was a mask of sympathy. But when Thomas asked for more information about the Handmaid Sisters, where their monastery was, the priest became evasive. Their founder was a Father Milford, he said. His son, Father Milford II, continues the ministry. But I cannot provide their location. They are a very reclusive order. No visitors. Driving away from the church, his promised beer sitting on the passenger seat, Thomas's mind was a storm. He spotted the 5 nuns climbing into a plain white van. On impulse, he decided to follow them. This was more than a hunch. It was a certainty that resonated deep in his bones. The van led him far out of town, into the desolate, rock-strewn landscape of the high desert. After nearly an hour, he saw it. A large compound surrounded by a chain-link fence. At the gate stood a small guardhouse. This was no peaceful monastery. It looked like a prison. He pulled off the road, watching from behind a cluster of mesquite as the van was admitted by a young, stoic Navajo watchman. While he waited, he opened the old cigar box he kept in his camper. Inside were his only treasures: the faded photo of his sisters, a piece of turquoise on a leather cord his father had made for him, and a pencil sketch he'd drawn from memory on a stolen lunch menu. Naomi braiding Eva's hair while Sarah sang. He stared at the scar he'd drawn on Naomi's temple. It was identical. The compound gate opened again, and a sedan drove out. In the brief moment the gate was open, he saw 2 nuns in the courtyard, embracing, one of them crying, before a third figure guided them back inside. This was not a sanctuary. He put the turquoise pendant on and walked to the gate. He showed the pendant to the young watchman, a silent appeal from one brother to another. "I can't help you much," the watchman said, his voice low and fearful. "But if you want answers, you need to talk to Father Milford II. His office is in Santa Dolorosa. Follow this road east for about 30 miles. Now you need to leave. This isn't a good place." "Are the sisters safe here?" Thomas pressed. The watchman's face was stone. "We all play our parts here," he said quietly, and his meaning was terrifyingly clear. The drive to Santa Dolorosa triggered a memory. He'd been here 20 years ago, when the town was called Cielo Seco. He'd been searching a canyon when he'd nearly fallen, and a researcher, a botanist named Clyde Yazzie, had saved his life. He found Father Milford's office, a modest house, on a quiet street. The same sedan that had left the compound was parked in front. He knocked, and the door swung open, unlocked. "Hello?" he called, stepping inside. A trail of dirt streaks and what looked like red fingernail scratches on the wall led down a hallway to a back door, which was ajar. Outside, stone stairs descended into an underground cellar cut into the rock. From the opening he heard it. A woman's muffled cries, the sharp crack of a leather strap, and a man's voice reciting scripture in a fervent, menacing tone. "Discipline purifies the soul and conquers the heathen spirits." This was a place of torture. He ran. At the police station, his frantic report was met with scorn. "You're talking about Father Milford II?" the sheriff sneered. "One of the most respected men in this town." He gestured to a photo on the wall. "This is his father, the founder, and this is Father Milford II, who continues his holy work." Thomas's blood ran cold. The man in the second photo, older and grayer, was the same priest from his 40-year-old newspaper clipping. The priest who had stood behind his sisters. "Leave town," the sheriff warned, "or I'll detain you." Powerless and terrified, Thomas found a payphone and dialed the number he hadn't used in 2 decades. "Clyde," he said, his voice shaking. "This is Tommy Red Elk. You saved my life 20 years ago. You said if I ever needed anything, I'm calling in that debt now." 10 minutes later, Clyde Yazzie's dusty pickup truck screeched to a halt. Tommy told him everything. "The local police won't help 2 Navajo men against a Catholic priest," Clyde said grimly. "But my cousin, Joe, is with the Navajo Nation Police. They have jurisdiction." They returned to the house, hiding in the brush. 2 men in white robes were carrying a limp figure in a black habit toward the sedan. Blood stained her face and clothes. Before they could put her in the car, Sirens wailed through the desert night. 3 vehicles, 2 from the Navajo Nation police, roared up the road. Father Milford II emerged from the house, his face a mask of righteous fury, his clothes spattered with blood. "This is church property," he declared. "You have no jurisdiction." But when the tribal officers gently lifted the injured woman, her condition was undeniable. She was so weak she couldn't stand. Tommy stepped closer, his heart pounding. The scar, the shape of her eyes. "Elise," he called out, his voice cracking, using her Navajo name. "Naomi!" The woman's head turned, her eyes focused on his face, and she gasped. Breaking a 40-year vow of silence, she spoke in halting Dene. "Ashki Yaji, Tommy." Silence fell. "This is one of my 3 missing sisters," Thomas announced, his voice ringing with the weight of 4 decades. At the regional hospital, the story finally unspooled. Sarah and Ava were brought from the compound, and the 4 siblings met in the waiting room, a reunion of ghosts made flesh. In a private room, the sisters told their horrifying story to the tribal police. After the 1945 press visit, Father Milford had told them they'd been chosen. He drove them to the secret compound, where they were trapped in a cloistered, abusive order. The vows of silence and penance were a cover for a brutal regime of physical and psychological torture, all justified as purification. The indigenous nuns were beaten for any infraction, while Father Milford also forced them to perform a twisted mix of Catholic and Navajo rituals to produce divine messages for wealthy donors who funded his operation. Their records at St. Gertrude's were falsified, claiming they'd been reunited with family. They had vanished from the world. Later, they gathered around Naomi's hospital bed. She was fragile, but her eyes were clear. "I can't believe this day has come," she whispered. Tommy took her hand. "We were so close this morning at the church. You were right there." Naomi squeezed his fingers, a faint smile on her lips. "God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? You received your answered prayer, Tommy. Not in words written on paper, but in flesh and blood." As the 4 siblings sat together, a fractured family finally piecing itself back together, the desert wind outside the hospital window seemed to quiet. For the first time in 40 years, it no longer whispered of loss. It whispered of hope.